We are going to do one more trigger exercise, just so you get a little better feel for how triggers work, because they are actually super, super cool. So this last scenario, our boss would like us to create a transaction table to monitor activity in this investors table. So this is part of the examples database. Kind of take a look here at the structure. Investor ID is an identity column. That is something to take note of because in this particular table, uh, it's auto-generated. So when you insert rows, you do not enter the investor ID. So what we need to do is we need to create a table called investor transactions. And we are going to be adding to that table anytime someone inserts a row into investors, anytime someone updates any of the columns, and anytime someone deletes from the investors table. So our first step is going to be to create this investor transaction table. And so there's actually a super easy way to do this. And we've looked at this before. We are going to select everything from investors, and we're going to put it into investor transactions. Because investor transaction doesn't exist, it is going to create it for us. And then you'll notice we have kind of a weird little where clause where 1 equals 0. Well, what this does, 1 never is going to equal 0. So it doesn't put any data in the table. So it just basically creates an empty table for us, which is exactly what we want. And it saves us all of the effort of keying all of that in. So we're going to go ahead and execute. Okay, and you can see it says 0 rows affected because we have where 1 equals 0. So let's refresh this. And then if we look, we should see now we do have investor transactions and we've got all of our columns. Now we do have a bit of an issue with investor ID because this is an identity column and this is going to be a problem. We don't want an auto-generated column in this transaction table. What we want is we want to be able to take the investor ID that's, ends up being added or changed or deleted, and we want to just take that existing ID and put it in here. So what we have to do is delete this. We have to drop it, and then we have to reinsert it. So I'm going to add in some comments here. And so the command that we need for this is alter table. And the table that we are changing is investor transactions. And then we are going to give the drop column command. And the column that we are dropping is investor ID. And we'll go ahead and run it. And it works. Now I'm going to take my little closing comment and move that down. Now our next step is to add some columns. So our boss had indicated that they want the date that this activity occurred, and they also want a status column that indicates, what happened. Was it inserted? Was it updated? Was it deleted? And of course, now we have to insert back the investor ID column that we deleted. So we are going to do several alter table commands. And so we're going to be adding investor ID. And if you remember, if you're going to add a column, what's a little weird is when you delete a column, you have to say drop column. But when you add a column, you just use the word add. Okay, so I already have these. I'm going to copy and paste over here. So I am going to be altering the investor transactions table. I'm just using add, and then this is the column I'm adding, and this is the data type. And then you see I have another one. The column I'm adding is called trans date for transaction date, and then that's a date data type. And then the final one is status, and the data type is variable character 30. Okay, so just to verify that those are in there, we can refresh our little table here. And then if we take a look, you'll see that it did put them at the bottom. And it really doesn't matter in this table what order things are. Okay, so having them at the bottom is fine. I'm going to go ahead, move my closing comment. So at this point, I do have this transaction table ready. And so the next step is to actually create the triggers. And so we have quite a bit of code because each one of these columns we have to declare a variable for. If we're going to, write out everything, from investors and store it over here, all of these have to be variables. And we're also going to create a variable for trans date and status because we are going to be storing the current date in trans date, and we are going to be storing some text in status. So we'll kind of start out here. Got a little comment. So this is our insert trigger. We're going to create our trigger. It's going to be called investors insert. Now, the reason we give it a name is if there's a problem with the trigger and we need to redo it, we can use a drop trigger command. So instead of create trigger, it's just drop trigger and then the name. So we can create it and we can delete it as long as we've named it. And so this trigger is going to be on the investors table. So when something happens to investors, and what we're looking for on this one is the insert. Okay, so when they insert on the investor table, then we're going to run through this code. And so we declare all of these variables. Okay, and so it's a variable basically for everything that is in our investor transaction table. Okay, and a lot of them match up identically with investors. The only ones that are different really are these last two because they're extra. Then we have to do a little select statement. When you insert, there is a temporary row created called inserted. And so what we're doing here is we are grabbing the data from that inserted row and we're putting it into our variables. Okay, so we're taking inserted dot last name and putting it into the last name variable. Inserted dot first name, put it into first name. Okay, and so on. Then you'll notice for the last two, of course, we don't have anything in inserted, right? Because obviously the transaction date and the status are not being inserted into this table. So we're just taking the trans date variable and we're setting it equal to get date, which is the current date. And then we're taking the status and we're setting it to inserted. Okay, and then for everything else, we're getting it from that inserted row. Okay, and then, so now we've told it what we need. Now we got to tell it where we need to put this. And so we need our insert into statement. And this is where we get it, all of that data, and we put it into investor transactions. So when someone inserts a row into investors, okay, so they do an insert into statement, all of that data is stored in the inserted row, which is temporary, and we're taking all that data and we are storing it in our variables, okay, plus the current date and the status. And now we're taking those variables and we are writing them to our investor transaction table. So we've got insert into investor transaction values. And so these are the variables that are storing all of those values. Okay, and so that will write to our table. And okay, and normally I execute these one at a time, but I already know they work. So I'm going to go ahead and do the deleted one. For the deleted one, this is super similar to the inserted. There's just a couple things you actually have to tweak. So you could just take this, right? And you can copy it and paste. And then this is our delete trigger. And so this is the investors. We're going to call it investors delete. And so this is after, not after insert. This is after delete. And we got all the same variables, so that part doesn't change. And what does change though is we're not grabbing this data from inserted, we are grabbing it from deleted. So I'm going to change this to deleted. And then I'm just going to do a little copy paste magic here. All right, and then for status, obviously we don't want inserted. We're going to say deleted. And we still want it to get the current date. Okay, and so then that gives us all of the data from that deleted row plus the current date plus our status. And then this part down here doesn't have to change, right? We still want to take all that data and insert it into investor transactions, so that part does not change. And so this is now our delete trigger. Now the last one is the update trigger, and the update trigger is similar to insert. So we can actually go back up here. This is why we do insert first. Gonna go up here and what that, we'll just copy all of this. All right, so now we're doing update trigger. And so obviously we're going to change the name to investors update. After update, all the same variables. And what's even more awesome is that updates and inserts use that temporary inserted row. So we don't have to really change any of this except the status. It's the status now should say updated. And we don't really have to worry about determining what was updated because we're writing out everything. So they're getting everything. So as far as doing some kind of an if to figure out what they changed, we don't need to worry about that. So at this point, our update trigger is done. So I'm going to go ahead because that's a lot to run at once. And I'm going to go ahead and run this. And it's not unusual for these names to be flagged. If anything else was underlined, you might want to take note. So I've already done this. Let me pause a minute and get rid of my existing triggers. That's how I know this code works. All right, now I'm going to run it. It should work because I got rid of the triggers that were there. Yay. Okay, so let me show you, just in case you end up having to run this more than once, where those triggers are located. So we created triggers on investors. Here's our investors table. Here's triggers. Let me refresh this. And voila, these are the triggers that I just created. So you can actually just right click and delete these if you ever needed to rerun this. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can also do the drop trigger command. Either one works. All right, so now we got our triggers. The only thing we really need to still do is test them. So I'm going to move my closing comment down. So what we're going to do to test is we actually have to add, change, and delete a row in investors, because that's what the trigger is on. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert a row, then we're going to change something in that new row, and then we're going to delete that row. And so that way we aren't going to mess with the rest of the table. So it is a good idea to do a little select on the original table. So that would look something like this. Select asterisks from investors. This is before we do any kind of messing around with it. Okay, and then we're going to do our insert. So that'll test that trigger. And so we're inserting into investors. Investor ID is identity. So we do not put a value for investor ID. It's auto-generated. But I do need to put in values for, the rest of it to make sure that it works. Okay, and that is what I did. And then I'm going to do an update. So I'm going to update this new row that I added. So this new row is being added into investors. So I'm going to update investors and I'm just going to change the address. And the where clause is super important here. Otherwise, you change the address on everyone's row. So make sure that you've got your where clause. Then I'm going to delete. And again, when you delete, that where clause is super important, or you delete everything. So we're deleting from investors where, and so this is where we're looking for the first and the last name to make sure we get the right one. Okay, and then to make sure that we have the trigger information in our new investor transaction table, we are going to do a select from that. And then we're going to select again from investors just to make sure that the original rows are still intact, that we didn't inadvertently change something, which would be bad, especially when we weren't meaning to. Okay, so these are just regular selects. And then we're going to go ahead and run it. So here's our original table. You can see there's 5 rows. And so here is our transaction table. So you can see that we did insert, we did update, and we changed the address. And then it was deleted. Now let's make sure that our original is still back to normal. So usually what I do is I just spot check some things. So I can tell looking at that bottom row, it looks fine. If I look in on the third row, that one looks okay too. So I would say that this is working. And of course, you can always do more inserts, updates, and deletes to verify that. But this trigger is in place and it is currently working. So at this point, you would make sure you get your file saved, and then you're going to upload the whole thing to Moodle.